Hello, hello. All right. Welcome to the stream, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. So today we are going to continue working on axum. Where did my browser go? There it is. Specifically, we're going to be working on this issue. Missing extensions are runtime errors rather than compile time errors. And this is an issue that we've had basically since the beginning of axum, I think. Let me just kind of show you what it looks like. Just make a little hello world thing here. So the way in axum currently that you sort of inject state into handlers, let's say we have some app state thing here, is you say you add a middleware called extension state, just empty like that. I believe it needs to derive clone, import it, and then the way you access that in the handler itself is you use the extension as an extractor, like that. And then we can like print it, state, if we derive debug, like that. And this is, of course, app state. We don't need that one. And then we can go ahead and run it. And then curl it. And this should work. So that prints, we get a 200, and it actually prints the app state. The issue then is, if we forget to do this, notice we don't get any compile errors. It still runs just fine. But when we go to actually run it, it fails with a 500 internal server error. And the error message says, extension of type app state was not found. Perhaps you forgot to add it. See axum extension. So ideally what we want is for this thing to be a compile error. So you can't extract an extension, or rather you can't extract a piece of state that you haven't also added to the router somehow. The approach that we're going to explore is not going to be using a middleware, but rather providing it to the router directly in the new method. And basically adding the state as another type parameter to the router. So this is what we're going to try to improve upon today. And the reason that it's sort of been hard is that we don't really have a strongly typed connection between the middleware that you add and the extractors that you use. They don't really know anything about each other. The middleware just kind of gets added to the router and the type is erased, and then it just sort of disappears and runs in the background. Whereas with extractors, we don't really know, we don't know anything about what middlewares have actually been added. So I think actually we can just try to code up a minimal solution of what we have in mind without any of the axum types, basically just fake the whole thing. So let's make a new empty crate here. New lib, let's call it axum state testing. Axum state testing. And so the design that we sort of have in mind is that you'll be able to say let app is router new, and then give it your state here. State is app state, like that. And that means we need a router. SB. We're basically just going to fake the whole thing here. Phantom data. SB. Why is Rust Analyzer not suggesting this? new takes a state, and it's just to do for now. Do we have a syntax error somewhere? Yes, we do. We need an S here. And we can just allow warnings for now, just to sort of move on. Hello, how y'all doing? So adding explicit type. We can just say we have a body. Router app state body. And then we want to be able to say something like .route and then some route get and then like a handler function. So let's just basically do what we have in axum and just sort of make this route method and just pretend that all the types actually exist. How does your Moonliner sound so good? I changed, so when I bought it, I got, what are they called? Cherry MX Brown switches, which are not the ones that I have in here. I actually changed them for, I don't remember what they're called. Kale Box something something. I don't quite remember. I should look that up maybe. And put that in the description. Cool. So we want let's imagine we have a tree called service, has an R, and then we have fn route, self, path stir, service s. Where s is service request b. And that means we need a struct request. T is already used, so let's just call this one, S is rather already used for the state, so let's just call that one T. Then we need a fn get. Actually, let's do trait handler T. So it takes the inputs to the handler, the state, and the B. I don't quite know about the ordering here. And then let's say import trait SB handler nothing SB for Fs, where F is a function. We don't really care about the return value instead at this point, because the extractor and state sharing is only about inputs basically. We also need from request takes a state and a B. So this is the thing that's new in the design that we're doing. Currently, the from request trait in axum, if we just pull it up, from request is only generic over the request body. But the solution or the idea that we have here is that it will be generic over both S and B, and then the same for the request parts. And then the request part is basically going to store the state inside of it. And then we'll add an accessor to get it, so that you can implement it in your own extensions, but we're also going to make like a state extension that actually extracts just the state. Why is that you prefer one letter generic over, let's say, state, which is maybe clearer? Mostly a force of habit. In this case, it would be sort of confusing, because I imagine that we're going to have an extractor called state. So if you did like state here, I mean, I don't know. I get your point that it's absolutely more clear to have it spelled out entirely, but yeah, I don't know. I don't think it's too bad, but it is mostly a force of habit. So let's say this one takes T1. This is basically what we do exactly in axum. There's nothing really new to this. Let's just, for good measure, do a T2. state state as in all uppercase. No, I would not do that. That looks super weird. I haven't seen that anywhere else. You meant like that? Because then this would be like inputs and like request body. That's really weird. I haven't seen anyone else do that. Is that something that you do, or do you just prefer it? Cool. And then in axum we also need, so we need the thing that get returns, and that's a method router. So let's see, we have a struct method router. It takes a S and a B. Stores the same thing, f and get, then takes a h, t, s, b. So this is the thing that I don't like about this design, is that these trait parameters, or type parameters, get kind of crazy. There's a lot of them. Let's just say handler h returns a method router sb, where h handler tsb. Like that. I think that is it. Oh yeah, and then so we're actually, the change that we're going to make in axum, if you look at method router, it currently implements service, but the proposal that we have and the idea that we have is that we're not going to do this. So method router won't implement service. I think we're going to add, like, because it contains the state, which means that you have to basically provide it to the method router and actually to be able to call it. And when you call get, you don't provide the state. The state is provided to the router, and then the router sort of makes sure that the state is threaded all the way through down to the method router. But I think we can do, like, if you want a method router and you want to make it implement service, then you can add like a dot supply state or provide state or with state method that just wraps the method router in a thing that ensures that the state is there, and then that wrapped method router will implement service. So that actually means that this route method is going to change to no longer take a service, but only take a method router. Because that's like the issue that we have now, is that even if we make the router have the state, if it just receives any T type that implements service, we have no idea what service this is. It might be a method router, it might be something else entirely. We don't, like, there's no sort of type connection between the state of this service, it might not even have state, and then the state that's in the router. So the idea is that to change this to only take a method router and then make another method called like route service or something like that, which kind of matches what we've been doing in the other streams, where we've like implemented where we did this one, where we added we split the nest method into nest and nest service. So having route and route service also kind of makes sense. I've actually been thinking that we should do the same thing to fallback, because currently fallback in axum fallback always takes a service, which means that if you want to pass a handler, which is what you do 90% of the cases, you have to call .into service, which I think is kind of annoying. I think we could make it take just a handler and then have one that's called like fallback service that takes a service. I think that would be a little more ergonomic. I don't think we have to do that here, but that's a thing that I'm thinking about. As far as I know, the generic params are set to be abbreviated with a single character also in the Rust book. Yeah, I mean, it's mostly convention. But we don't really have anywhere else where we use single letter variable names. So I think it is a valid point, but yeah. Some people prefer fully stating the generic param because they find it clearer, but I could still in other libraries has no such pattern. Yeah. It is kind of annoying when you have, like, if you have methods like this that have like 4 types. That's a lot. The hope is that users won't really have to worry about what this means, but it is definitely a thing to be aware of. Where were we? Oh yeah, so let's say that let's just make a comment about this route service. this one now takes a method router, SB. I think we can just remove this type entirely. Was that everything that we needed? I think so. Oh yeah, we actually need the handler function, fn handler. Cool. So like normally this function would be async and it would have to return response and all this stuff, but that's not really important for the sort of exploration that we're doing here. The idea is just to sort of give you guys who are watching an idea of where we're going when we start actually work on Axum, and also just to prove to ourselves that it actually does work. Because otherwise it's easy to have an idea in mind, spend like an hour and a half implementing it only to reach like a certain point where you're like, oh, Rust can't actually infer the types at all. So this is just to sort of prove it to ourselves. Nice, but we don't actually have any way to get the state out. So let's say that our from request, actually we don't need to make the request part. So we can just say we have a struct state, takes an S, holds an S, infiltrate, SB, from request SB, for state S, like that. And then we say here T1 implements from request S and B, and same one here. And then we should be able to say this one is state, whatever, state, app state. And that works. That actually compiles. If we change that to nothing, then it doesn't compile anymore, and said that it expected a method router of app state, but it got one of unit. And that's because that's the state that we're extracting up here. Awesome. And just to verify that we're not crazy, let's say that unit is also a from request, just to be like, hey, it actually works in like any position. Like that works too. Obviously, it's also gonna work here. That's just because both of these implement from request, so the order doesn't really matter. Handler 2. Like that. Cool. So this is the sort of refactoring that we have in mind, that we're going to make the axum. That when you make the router, you have to provide the state explicitly. I think we might do like a router without state constructor that just sets the state to unit. Or we might just require people to do this. I'm not entirely sure. But that's a thing that we could totally add later. How does this work relate to the other draft PR maxim for the type safety of extractors, where only the last one is allowed to take ownership of the body? No, you're not spamming. That's quite all right. So it doesn't really relate to it at all, basically. But they definitely sort of touch the same code. So the PR that they're referring to is this one, where currently we have the bug/footgun, I'm not quite sure what to call it, where if you extract the request first and you extract an extension afterwards that you know are there, that you've added with the extension middleware, it'll seem as if this extension is just gone. And that's because of how the request extension or the request extractor is implemented, that it removes all the extensions, because we can't clone the extensions, so we have to consume them effectively. So the change that this PR makes is basically add another type parameter to from request that's like either mute or once. So it's basically a mini type state kind of thing, where only once, only if the type, the first type param here is once, then only then are you allowed to consume the request body or extensions or those things. And then the way that we implement from handler for functions is that only the last one is allowed to consume anything from the request. So in this case, T1 is the only one, so it's the last one. So this one would implement once, and this one would use mute, and then this one would use once. And I don't think these conflict at all, because you can still do this. Like, our idea is that request parts will have the state on it and just have an accessor to get an immutable reference. And then basically down here, we'll just have to clone it, which I think is fine. So it means that we'll get a third type param here, which is kind of unfortunate, but otherwise I don't think they collide, really. Is there a way to test or assert that something doesn't compile? Yes, yes and no. So the sort of hacky approach that you sometimes see is that people will make like a sum function, and then they'll make a doc string on that. And in here you can say no compile or something. I don't exactly remember what it is. And then Rust will basically verify that the stuff that you put in here doesn't compile. That's the sort of easy approach. If you want to go like sort of do it properly, you want to use a crate called try-build, which basically allows you to write sort of UI tests for proc macros and those kinds of things that can like assert that the output looks correctly. So we use that in Axum a fair bit for the Axum macros crate. Let me show you. So you'll write like, these are for example the test cases for debug handler, where you'll be like, this file should pass. And then we have a folder over here called fail as well, where you're like, this thing should not fail, or should fail to build. And the reason that this fails is because bool is not an extractor. And then next to it, you provide a file that ends in .std error, and then it tells you what the error message should be. And then when you actually go to call this in your code, I don't even remember where we put this. I think we put that in the test in here. Yeah, then you just invoke the try build crate, and you're like, hey, the file in this folder should fail, and the file in this folder should pass. And then they run those. So you can't like assert at compile time that something shouldn't fail, but you can like write a test for it, which is very common when you do procedural macros. Yeah, so they both touch from request, but they don't conflict. But I'm not a fan of how we're going to end up with 3 type parameters on from request. I think once you go past 2, like 3 and more type params is uncommon for sort of libraries that you want to be approachable for beginners. But I definitely think the trade-off is worth it, given that we were able to fix 2 long-standing bugs that we've had since 0.1 basically. So I do think it's worth it, but it's something that I'm definitely aware of. All right. I do have one other thing in mind that I actually want to, like one little improvement that I want to try and make. And the idea is that if you have like nested states, so imagine that we have some inner state. And then this one has an inner of an inner state like this. Then I would like to be able to extract, let's just remove this one. I would like to also be able to extract inner state. And the idea is that maybe you have, maybe your router is like split up into multiple, is defined in multiple modules. And you have like one that's like your front end that have some piece of state that maybe they don't access the database. Maybe they have an API client or something like that. And then you have your API routes that does have access to the database. So I think this would sort of be a nice pattern to support. And the approach that I have in mind that I think is actually going to work is you'll be able to say infiltrate from app state for inner state. So this allows you to, if you have an app state, you can get the inner state in sort of a generic way. And then down here in state, we say that you extract a, I don't know, S2 where S implements into S2. Like that. And we obviously need to bound it down here. So what this means is that if you, this basically says sort of the opposite of what this one does. But when you implement from, you get an implementation of into for free. And typically in trait bounds, you use the into trait rather than the from trait. I don't actually know if that's necessary anymore. I don't think so. But I think it reads a little bit nicer in the trait bounds. So this effectively means that from request knows about the outer state. But as long as you can get an inner state from the outer state, well, then you can extract that one as well. And you can actually see that now this up here, this compiles successfully. And then if we remove this one, then it no longer compiles because the from implementation is missing. So I think this is the approach that we're going to pursue for Axum. I think this is quite nice because this means that you basically get most of the benefits from just using extension. You still need like one type that holds all your state. You can't sort of, like, you can't segment it in quite the same way that you can with, it's not like decoupled in the same way that extension is. But obviously from that little bit of coupling that you have to add by making your own like state that holds all the stuff, then you get most of the benefits and a lot of type safety in return, which I think is going to be really great. I think this pattern is going to feel somewhat familiar to people. Tide does a very similar thing where they provide the state directly to the router here, whereas in their setup they just have the state stored directly on the requests. So then you would have like request state like that, or like app state. But obviously we cannot do this in Axum because our request type is the request type from the HTTP crate, which is generic over the request body and doesn't have any notion of state. It just uses extensions. And obviously, I also think, I think this change is going to be annoying to some, maybe. But I mean, adding the route service method is going to be, so it's easy to convert to that if what you're routing to is actually a service and not a method router. But I think in like 9 out of 10 cases, people are routing to method routers that they create with like these get and post or patch methods, whatever, and they use async handler functions. And obviously, we're not going to remove extension, so people can just continue to use that if that's what they want and if that fits better with their use case. But I think most people should write their apps in this way. So unless there's any questions about this setup, I think we're basically going to move over to Axum and try to actually implement it. I'm not quite sure where to start because we're going to have to touch like most of the code. Yeah. I think maybe adding route and route service first is a good place to start. What should we call the branch? Router state extractor. Routing mod. Cool. So let's say this one, this is now route service. Have another one called just route. Takes a method router, which currently is just generic over one type. Like that. And that doesn't compile Y. So this is in Nest. I'm not really sure how we're going to make this work with Nest. I know that in the other PR, where we refactored most of the code around how nesting works, we added the separate nest and nest service method, where the one that's just called nest takes a router. So this code has definitely changed in that other PR. So I think we can maybe just call nest service here. And then we should probably add a note to ourselves that we should test nested routers with state. I don't really know where we should write that down. Let's just write it down here. Test nested routers with state. And the reason that this complains is that strip prefix is an internal middleware that we have in Axum that basically removes this prefix from any from the URI of any request that passes through it. And that's obviously a service, not a method router, so we have to pass it to route service rather than route. And this is the same, route service. Let's just see if there's any other places in here where we call this. I don't think there is. Oh yeah, there's one thing that I want to do, and that is I just want to focus on Axum first, Axum and Axum core probably. So I think we'll uncomment, basically remove, like temporarily remove Axum extra and Axum macros from the workspace, just so we don't get any compile errors from those crates. And we'll go back. Give Rust Analyzer some time to do its thing. We're still getting compile errors from Axum extra. That confuses me a little bit. All right. I guess that's a to-do. I kind of want to get to the point where we can just change like method router and from request and request parts and all these things. I think that was everything building now. Cool. So then let's say, I think we can actually change. So if we look at like the implementation of any, so this is similar to get in that it takes any method instead of just like get or post or whatever. So this one doesn't actually care about what state the handler takes. So I think we can actually add state to handler here. The question is in what order we want the params. The reason that B, the request body, is the last one is that it has a default value. So usually when you add type parameters to a trait or to any type like this, it's nice to sort of think about in the future which type parameter are you most likely to add a default value for, if any. And I think actually the type params on handler used to be swapped. So B was first and T was last. But that obviously means we can't add a default if B isn't the last one. So I think you're definitely not likely to specify the defaults for T, because T is like the input to the handler. So those are the function arguments that you take. And then you're probably more likely to use to set the default, the state, to have a default of unit. I don't think we're going to do that. But like putting the state in the middle definitely makes that a possibility. So that's going to fail in a bunch of places. We're basically just going to thread it through, make the compiler happy. That's a little annoying. What is S here? And T. Yeah, I think so. The reason this doesn't work, like if we add, let's say this is S2. S2 is the state. Does that? Oh, that does work. No. Okay, that's a different thing. Cool. What do we call it then? Because we already have S is like that's the service, and T is are the inputs. Why do we store that? I'm honestly not sure why we store that here. Is that because if we didn't, it would be an unconstrained type parameter? Maybe. Let's just call this one SVC for service. And then we can add a new one called S. And this one can't infer the type of S. That is okay. We can just say handler of string. You can probably just infer that one. No state. Infer into service. Like that. I think. Handle. So these two are basically equivalent, where if you... So handle is a function that implements the handler trait. And then you can call the into service method, and that is like a thing that takes self. But you can also just call the handler trait method like this. This is called fully qualified syntax, I believe. And then specify the values that you want for all the type parameters. In this case, since we're not using any like state extractor or anything, it can't figure out what type you actually want for S. I think what we're going to end up with is that into service has to both take self and the state. So that if you like take just the handler and you convert that into a service, like run it on Hyper or whatever, you need the state at that point, because there's no router there to sort of inject the state for you. You need to provide it when you're converting the handler into a service. So if we remove that one, it should fail. For the same reason, just bring it back. Now method router is going to complain because this also takes an S, like that. What is it complaining about? I want to like see the full error. Oh my god. Cannot infer type parameter S. I think we're going to have to make the refactoring that we know we're going to make anyway of saying this one takes a state, and that's an S. Yeah. We don't have to pass it in yet. We can do that later. This one takes a state. Handle into service of nothing. We want S here as well. The reason that worked before is that it would basically assume that like this is the state, and then there's like a hidden b equals body here. Yeah, and now this type is not constrained by the implementation because it's not mentioned here and it's not mentioned here. It's only mentioned down here as like a generic type and not an associated type. So that means into service needs to have the state after all. Let's just put it here. I mean, we're going to do that anyway. Might as well do it now. New handler state S. Can I ask you a question about Rust programming? Yes. Anytime. And then S is mentioned here and should now actually be constrained by the impl. Like that. This one takes an S. So these types are like super gnarly, but I don't think that's a huge deal because people are unlikely to have to name these types. Usually you construct one of these in your main method and you just bind it to a local variable and Rust can infer the type and then you run the server from there. I think it's rare that people need to store these in like structs and stuff or return them from functions. I have heard from some people who do that. But in that case, you just have to name the type. But it is definitely created to have this many generic type params. I have a DLL created in C++. Do you have any resources on how to make Rust call the DLL created in C++? No, I've never done stuff like that. I have no idea how to do it. The person in chat is probably right that you need some sort of FFI bridge thing. But I have no clue. Try asking on the Rust Discord or on the Rust users forum. Or on Reddit even, there might be stuff there. This one takes the S here. Oh, this one sucks. Why are we calling into service here? So this method applies a middleware to a handler. So you can say like if you have a handler function, you can say .layer, give it a middleware, and then pass that directly to get. But you wouldn't want to like have to provide the state here. That's weird. So I think we'll have to refactor this and like revisit it some other time. I think we can probably just make that one a to-do and then get back to it later. All right, so there's a bunch of things that are failing now. I don't even know where to begin. Probably method router here. Into service. That one takes the state now. But we don't have the state. You can't provide the state to any. What if there were two ways to convert a handler into a service? There was this method into service that takes the state. And then there's another one that expects the state to be in a request extension. So it's effectively sort of provided lazily. And then the method router, before it calls the service, can make sure, or the router itself even, can make sure to set that as a request extension. And that happens automatically, internally, basically. How would that work if you have nested routers? I think so. What if you have nested routers that set different states? Like the same type, but different values. That's probably a weird thing to do, but it feels like something that we should support. Let's make a note of that. Let's see, nested routers with different states of the same type. And then we could have something like into service that just looks in the request extensions. I think we can do that. And this is wrong. This is just testing that into service is actually send and sync. And the state is the third type param, not the second. Let's call it into service. Like state passed via extension. That's super verbose. It's just going to be an internal type, so the name doesn't really matter that much. Into service state in extension. Not the best name, but I mean we can change it. Pub crate. It should be similar to the other one. Into service state in extension. And this one doesn't have the state stored. It just knows what the type is. Like that. State is not there. It's not there. It's also not there. That means we don't need state to be cloned. And then here we can be like, right, state is request extensions get and then S needs to be send sync static for it to work as an extension. It's got to be clone as well. And this, if it's not there, that's a bug in Axum, because we should be providing that one always. So let's say state extension missing. This is a bug in Axum. Please file and issue. Cool. And then it is that at some point we're going to have to like provide that to the handler or to the request or something like that. I'm not quite sure yet how we're going to get that in there, but I mean we'll definitely get to it. We can even add like a to-do to remind ourselves about it. So that means this one can then use this one just takes a service. So we can say into service, what do we call it? Into service extension. It's just in the file. That's probably because it's not exported here. Yep, pub create use self into whoops new handler. S cannot be shared. The new method is private. That needs to be pub crate and not super. What keyboard is that? It is a set is a Moonlander. Let's all the places in here where we mention handler, let's just go through and add the state param. Because we have like a bunch of macros and stuff. Did we need to add it here? It's there. We want it here. Wait, this is on a self. And the method router has this state. It doesn't have it yet, but it's going to get it in the future. How content are you with the keyboard? Very. I've had it for over a year, it feels like. And I really like it. Again, S here. $25 errors. Wonderful. What did we call that one? New. And we need the same bounds here. And in this case, it can't infer what the type actually is. do we have to specify it? What is okay? Currently, we're just trying to get things to compile, and then later we can go through and look at the changes that we actually made and be like, is this actually the API that we want? So this one compiles for the same reason, and really it should be able to infer the state from here. So I think actually we can go ahead and add the state param to method router. So that one needs to be the first param. Like that. And we're going to get like a million errors now. I'm guessing you have a layer or something for the Danish letters. I've been looking at the Moonlight and I'm thinking of getting one. I don't have a separate layer, but I have like a keyboard command to switch between Danish and English keyboard layout. I hope Rust will take off in the industry eventually. Getting into the Linux kernel is a big pass. Yeah. I've never done any kernel development. I have no idea how to do that, but it's definitely sort of a stamp of approval kind of thing that it is sort of allowed to be used in a kernel. It's pretty cool. I think Rust is going to have. I think Rust is going to have a great future, but I think Rust is already like great now. There's so many people who are, so many companies out there that are already using Rust. So yeah. So this is a service. What method is this? This is top level handler service. Let's change this param to T. And let's say we also have an S. Whoops. This one has a handler, and then it goes there. And I think we need the same bounds here. Curious if we just do like get service and provide it a service, it's not going to be able to infer what the type of S is. That's a little annoying if you use method router on its own. But then again, method router just on its own won't implement service. You have to actually provide the state, even if the state is just an empty tuple. And then from that point, I think Rust is able to infer what the state will be. So I think this is actually going to work out. S goes there. And I'm just kind of renaming these types to T because we're going to be using S to mean state, sort of all over the code. It's a little unfortunate that we have to change that, but it's not too bad. S, where S is like that. What is this one? it was complaining about something here. I don't quite remember what it was. I have no experience with ergonomic / split keyboard. This look quite ergonomic. Yeah, it's okay. I used to have I still have the Kinesis Advantage, which is also a split keyboard, but the keys are like sort of in like a dome or well, whereas these are totally flat. And I think that is more ergonomic because you have to stretch and sort of move your fingers less. That keyboard is strictly less customizable than this one, which is why I switched. I know that Kinesis is working on / has released a new one that is also a split keyboard, but is way more customizable. I think I'm gonna want to get that. Maybe I don't know if it's out yet. Maybe one of you guys know. This becomes an S. This is now the same S. We don't need that here anymore. What functions are generated here? This S goes away. It releases this fall. All right, cool. I think I'm definitely gonna check that out. I think the main reason that I wanted to switch from the Kinesis was that I wanted different switches. The ones that I had in my Kinesis were MX Browns, and I had gotten kind of tired of those. But yeah, it's a good keyboard. Say this is T, this is S. This is T as well. What is this one complaining about? It just keeps the state here. Yeah, honestly, like I don't know much about switches either. It's really hard if you're like gonna figure out which ones you want. It's a jungle, and I don't know anything about like soldering either. That's why I really wanted to get this one, because it has hot swap, so you can just like pop the caps off and take the keys out, and there's like a little tool that you get that you can use to do that. This one takes S there. So at this point, the default type params are kind of annoying, because now it thinks the state is request body, which it obviously isn't. But feels like we're fewer errors. We're down to 20 now. This is S. But we're going to be removing this implementation. So let's maybe do that later, because we're going to have something very similar where there's like a method router with the state, and I imagine that's going to be basically identical to this. Cool. So many tests are failing. How are we going to do method router new? I feel like we almost want to do the change where method router is not service. because then this will not compile, because I think call is just like a helper that we have that takes a service. Are all these tests the same? Yeah, that's just like that. Okay, into service. That's interesting that this one can't infer the type of S. What does post service look like? Yes, does show up there. It is carried through. I wonder if that's going to be an issue. Three, four. Which one was S? Third. Oh, and it's obviously not S. Right. So new method router new. It doesn't know what the state is at this point, because we don't like add any handlers to it or anything like that. So let's. I think we should make the wrapped thing, so method router doesn't implement service anymore. The question is what we should call it. Method router with state, I guess. SBE. And it's pub. And it's going to have to implement at least debug and clone. Whoops. Whoa. Clone for hello. I don't know what Rust Analyzer is doing. And the reason that we can't derive clone is that then the code that the derive macro generates will also require S, B, and E to be cloned. But we only need S to be cloned. So we have to write them out by hand. Clone is not implemented for method router. Why not? Because we need an S here. It's very annoying that we have to find all instances of method router where we only have 3 type params. Let's just search through all of them in this file. 3 there. We can probably search for method router like that. Seems that we have most of them. And now we're down to the tests. All right, so that should compile, which it doesn't. Why? Ah, that's okay. What's that code action plugin? I don't remember what it is called. It's one of the new NeoVim LSP things. I think the UI that opens is maybe Telescope? Pop-up? Honestly, I'm not sure. I think if you type !config in chat, you get a link to my .files, which are on GitHub. And then you can like poke around and see the LSP plugins that I have. So we want format as well. Debug rather, not format. Debug. Why is it so slow at opening? Yeah, so that one just does the whole thing and then the state. Front debug. And then this one is method router with state. And then we want to say, like, let's actually just make that one a to-do. Set state in request extensions. Because we're going to write a test for this, but currently we're just working on getting the code to compile. And then on method router, we want a method to supply the state. And we have a bunch of impulse, so the question is just where we want to add it. We could add it here. Like this impl has B is send and static. I mean, we could move new down there. That wouldn't really matter much, but I guess we can just put it here. Pub, what do we want to call it? With state, provide state. State. Let's do with state. Self state s sbe. So then this one is with state of empty. And that compiles now. That's nice. Here we say with state. So this is not super ergonomic in this case when you're using method router directly like this as a service. I don't think a lot of people are doing that. So I'm not too concerned with it. we could add like 2 constructors to method router. Like a public one that's just new, that always takes the state, or like one, or a private one that doesn't take the state, but then assumes that the state will be provided by the router. But that still means that if you're doing like .get.post and wanted to run that as a service, then you would still need this one. So I'm specifically thinking of like if you did get okay, post okay, and you wanted that one to be a service, then you would have to do with state. Alternatively, we could also do that, such that if, and just say like this use case up here is just not something we support. There is no with state method. You have to make a method router, and like this is the only way publicly that you can add method router, or add a state to a method router. That is nice because it's more consistent with router. And honestly, no, we cannot do that. We cannot do that because that means that so this one changes it to return a different type. It doesn't return a method router anymore. Whereas if we provide the state directly to the constructor, then method router has to store the state internally, which is what we want to avoid. So I don't actually think we can do this. And I think we're stuck with a with state method. With state. Why does it complain about hyperbody being cloned? That's because method router here needs an S. We'll just have to make that a type on the method for now, but yeah. And all these are gonna have to change. Fallback into service. Yeah, this is why I wanted to change fallback to always take a handler rather than a service. Because the use case currently is that you make a handler function and call .into service on that one. But doing that one now requires passing the state, which is sort of annoying because you're adding the fallback to the router that has the state. So why do you want to have to provide the state to the fallback specifically? So let's actually comment this one out and say add fallback and fallback service. Same here. Same here. I think these should compile now. Only one type error left in this file. Nice. And obviously I can't infer the type, that's fine, because we haven't provided that type anywhere here, and we just say, hey, there's gotta be an S here. But soon we'll make that the generic a type of the router itself. So for now we can just say empty tuple, and then that'll fail to compile later. And just for fun, how many compile errors do we have? Oh my god. How many was that? 126. Fun times. Most of the stuff is in tests, which is actually kind of good. So we sort of get a feel for what it's like to use just from writing the tests. So we actually use axum a lot in axum itself, if you will. I think I'll be back in like just a couple of minutes. I'll just go refill my water. Hopefully people are able to somewhat follow. I get that if you're not like intimately familiar with the code in the way that I am, then there's a lot of stuff going on and we're making a lot of changes and that might be hard to follow. But hopefully it does somewhat make sense, at least the destination that we're moving towards. Cool. I think the next logical place to go is router. So this one gets a state. Just state. And then new state will be provided the new. State. I wish I was proficient with Rust, but still can't wrap my head around it. So fun fact, it took me 3 tries to sort of learn or stick with Rust, rather. So I gave up twice. There's definitely a learning curve to it, and it's very different from other kinds of languages, but I mean, if you stick with it and you use it enough, you do eventually learn it. It's not unlearnable at all. Most of the time when I encounter an issue, I try to add ampersands and stars. Yeah. I do that too. It's normal. Over time, you sort of learn what the problems usually are and how the ampersands and stars fixes it. And then you're like, I know this kind of issues, then I usually need 1 ampersand and 2 stars. But yeah, it's a thing. But that shouldn't like discourage you from using the language. I feel like often lifetimes is sort of what turns people off. But if you look at the Axum code base, there's very few, if any, lifetimes there. Like there's stuff like tick static, but I mean that's fairly straightforward. I don't know that there's any methods that have many lifetimes going on and like pass references around. I'm not really sure how we're gonna deal with nesting routers that have state. So let's maybe get back to that at some point. We did have some notes around that. So I'm not going to add a dedicated to-do here. This one has the same state. Oh, that's funny. How do you merge states? Because what this does, what merge does currently, is if you have like two routers, docs, axum, so you can write like a user router and a team router and then like merge them together like this. But how's that going to work with the state? Because you would have to provide the state here and here. It feels like we sort of need to store the state on each route, right? So that when this router knows, it knows the state. And when you add a method router to it, it adds the state to the method router, effectively. But you're gonna have to provide state here as well. So then when you merge routers in, it shouldn't have to change the state, or should it? I guess bun looks interesting, or looks promising. What is that? Bun. Oh, was that the new JavaScript runtime thing that was like gonna compete with Dino or something? I think I read something about that somewhere. So this kind of sucks. How are we gonna do this one? So we'll have to put in like some state here, and some state here, and some state here. I feel like we could probably store the states directly on the routes themselves. I think that's fairly straightforward. But the question is, if you have like, if we say this is 1, 2, 3, and you then say .route, what state does this one see? Does it see 1, 2, or 3? I feel like it makes sense that it sees. If you write it like this, it kind of makes sense that it sees 3, right? Because these are sort of independent sub-routers almost. But what if you write this? What state does this one see now? Does it see this one? I guess. Or do we just say that if you merge a router, the state is just dropped? But that's sort of annoying because then you have to make the router on its own and provide the state when you make it. And then when you merge it, the state goes away. So why did you have to provide it in the first place? And I don't think that you can imagine that we have a way to construct a router that, where you don't provide the state, only such that that router can be merged into other routers. But that means that if you make one of these routers without any state, then you have to have a way to provide the state later. Which is sort of unfortunate that we need two ways of setting the state, basically. I think this is something that we're going to have to implement it and write some tests for it and then sort of see if we can figure out anything that makes sense while we have some code to actually use and sort of explore and play with. Because currently I'm not sure what the best answer is. I feel like I'm leaning towards that the state is stored directly on the routes, and when you merge it, you don't change the state on the router that you are merging into. So in this case, the state of the outer router is 3. We merge user routes. That knows its own state that happens to be 1. We merge the team routes. That has its own state that happens to be 2. But it doesn't impact the state of the outer router, where this one is 3, where the state is 3. So when we add a new handler, the state that this one sees is 3, because these don't change it. That also means that if you do stuff like this, that means this one doesn't change the state of user routes. So when you add something like this, the state that this handler would see is 1, because we're effectively doing this up here, similarly to this. Does that make sense? I think so. I think there's also a way to implement it like that, because we'd have to store the state on the method router somehow, or maybe set it in extensions. I don't know. But yeah, it feels like that's what we want. But that also means that the state here needs to be the same. So that means this is the inner state. And we can effectively drop it, because the routes here on the inner route are the ones that we're like merging into. So the one on the right side, like these, the arguments to merge, those will already have stored the state on the routes individually. Yeah. Basically, what I imagine that route is just going to do is it takes a method router, it calls like service.withState, self-state clone, and then says self route service of that. Something like this is sort of what I have in mind, because now this is a method router. If we call with state, we get back something that implements service, and then we just add that as a standard route. That means that we're effectively storing the state on each inner method router individually, and I think we would get this behavior that we were describing before for free, effectively. Whoops. So that means here we need to say S is sensing clone. We can drop the state there. Can we take a method router that takes any other state? I'm sort of, because the state Like the state is already there. Once you've merged the router, you can't add any new state. But I think like if we were to do S2 here, I'm not sure that Rust would be able to infer what type S2 is. Maybe we should add a note for that. Can we use a different state type here? Since the state cannot be changed, it has already been provided. Setting a middleware on the router doesn't impact the state. Neither does a route layer. A route layer is just a middleware that doesn't run for the fallback. Effectively, that means that it's a middleware that only runs if you have a route that matches the request. And that's for things like authentication. You don't want, because if you run middleware always, even for like unknown routes for 404s, then you would turn all 404s into unauthorized, which is usually not what you want. Hello, how's it going? Router. We're babysitting a dog, so that's might be the howling in the background that you're hearing. Just came home from a walk. We need to somehow pass the state in here. I'm not quite sure how we're actually going to do that. Let's just make a note. Set. No, we don't need to do that because that is done individually for each route. S is not constrained. That makes sense. This one is like that. Route. This one has to check for method router with state. So when you store a route, or an endpoint in this case, inside of a router in Axum, we need to track whether it's a method router or just some generic service route that we don't know anything about. And the reason that we need to do that is if you write something like this, router new .route some path get and post, this doesn't mean that you want to add a new route and only handle post for that. It means you want to handle both get and post for this route. So it's effectively the same as .get .post, which is another way to write it. So that means that when you add the second route, we need to check if any of the previous routes that have been added for this path is a method router. Because if so, we can merge those together. So that's why this enum basically stores which thing are we actually dealing with. And then that changed everything. That gets an S. This one was clone if S was clone. This has the S. Infallible. Oh yeah, this requires clone, send, sync, static, and this one requires where S. No method merge. That makes sense because you cannot merge method router with state. You can only merge method router. Is that a problem in terms of the state? I think so, because how do you merge? How do we know that it's the same S? On any individual router, the S is always the same. So if you do this, can you get into a situation where the state that this one knows about is different from the state that this one knows about? No, I don't think so. But I don't think this is correct anyway. I think this method, I think actually we need these to be two different methods, maybe. Because probably because of this problem. I'm struggling to even describe what the problem actually is. Does that mean there's not a problem after all? What I'm sort of contemplating is so here we convert the method router into a method router with state, and then we call route service. That takes a service. It checks if what you passed it is a method router with state, which it will be if we come from up here. Then it looks in all the routes that it currently has, finds the endpoint that we have for the current, for the path that you're adding. We check, is that a method router? If so, we're in this situation and we need to merge them. What if you call route service directly and you do something like this? Method router new. No, you just say get have something with state 1 and post with state 2. This one goes in here. It is a method router with state that you're passing. That's what this returns. That means we hit this thing down here and we have to try to merge them. How does that deal with the state? Or does it? Because if these were separate if these implementations were totally separate and the route didn't call route service, then endpoint method router would just always store the method router and not the method router with state, which I think is what we want. So this one is not going to do that. It's just going to be a to-do. This one, it just checks if it doesn't even do any check at all. It just assumes that what you're passing is an opaque service, and then it just treats it that way. Let's just comment all that out and get back to it later. This is always like sort of curious. How much time do you spend making the code right versus getting it to build? My priority is usually get it to build first and just add like to-dos and comments and all this stuff everywhere for the kind of things that you want to fix when it actually builds. I don't really have a good heuristic for the order in which to do things. Oh yeah, so that meant that endpoint down here just stores a method router. Like that, but it does need the state. That's fine. Why is that one complaining? Expected struct Why did it expect a hyperbody? Because we're missing S here. So all this stuff inside a nest has basically been changed in the other PR. So I don't think we're gonna have to worry about this actually. Yeah, and this one is no longer called. This one that's a method router. So do we have to provide the state here? I think so. What does this one expect to return? A route future. Inner. Can we say inner clone with state? So here we're cloning the service, which for those of you who are familiar with Tower has the Tower service trait. It has a method called pull ready that you have to call first before you are allowed to even like call the service. Sort of a way to sort of reserve that the service has capacity to handle at least one request. But when you clone a service, obviously that reservation goes away. Otherwise, you could reserve capacity to send the service one request, make a million clones, and then you've essentially created capacity, which is not a thing, which is not allowed. So generally, when you clone a service, whatever capacity was reserved has been dropped. So that means that when you clone a service, you generally don't want to call the call method directly. You usually have to call pull ready again. I'm just curious, how does method router actually deal with that? With readiness. And I believe actually it doesn't and always just calls one shot. Yeah, it does. So one shot basically sort of, I'm not sure that I want to get too much into this, but basically in Axum in general, we sort of have to disregard back pressure, because the fundamental idea of back pressure is that you're able to reserve capacity before sending it a request. But since you have many routes that are all their own service, you don't know what route to call before you have a request and can actually do routing, figure out which endpoint to call. But that means that we then once we have the request, then we'll be able to make sure that and actually call pull ready and reserve capacity. But the idea is that we call pull ready before we have a request. So the only thing that we can really do is just assume that is when you get a request, or before you get a request, you make sure that all routes are ready. But what you usually run into, or what you end up with in Axum, is when you use these like handler functions, they don't care about readiness and they're always ready. So instead what we do is we just call one shot, which is a combinator on the tower service trait that just allows you to get a future that both drives readiness and sends a request sort of in one go. So we're effectively bypassing the pull ready back pressure implementation entirely, which is not optimal, but that's sort of the trade-off that we have to make. How is pull ready typically implemented? I think if you look at some middleware in Tower itself, like concurrency limit is probably a good place to look. In the case of concurrency limit, it's basically just a semaphore that it has inside of it that it pulls inside of pull ready. So it checks if there's already a permit that's been acquired. If so, we're done. Otherwise, it pulls the semaphore. It pulls the semaphore, and if it has a permit, then it pulls the inner service. But if you're using Axum, you can basically disregard that entirely. There's a section in the docs somewhere. Like if you actually care about back pressure, how should you deal with it? So I think this is fine, because even though we call without calling already, the actual implementation of this doesn't care about readiness. So here it's always ready. Well, what the hell happened? Down here, method router with state is always ready. So we don't need to call pull ready first. But all the handler functions always return that are ready. Exactly. So if we look at the handler trait, fn into service, it implements service down here, and here in pull ready, it just says it's always ready. So there's no way for you, if you make a handler function that like takes extractors and all these things, there's no way to customize back pressure there. Then you have to write a tower service by hand. Because it's very rare that you actually care about back pressure for an individual handler. Typically you would have like a middleware, like concurrency limit, that does care. So that's kind of the assumption that we make. Let's see. And here it needs S to be clone and all those other things. This one. Hey, look at that. This file actually type checks. Very nice. I'm curious, how many errors have we got? We're at 126 before. So there's more now, and that's because all the places where we call router new, we have to now call router and give it a unit, which is annoying. That means should that default the state to unit, and then we have a router with state constructor. I think we should do that, actually. Mostly because it makes it easier for people to update. Because everybody's using axum 0.5 today, calling new without any arguments, and using extensions to pass state. If they want to upgrade to or convert to using this new state machinery that we're adding, then they can do that. But if they want to continue using extensions, they can also just do that. I believe Tide actually does the same thing. They have like a new function that doesn't take any arguments. It just creates a server with unit state. And I think they have like a with state function that gives you a server that has the state. I think we should do the same. So that means we need this one goes on its own. And then this one, I mean, it can just be self new of that or with state. And then this one is with state. Like that. Ooh, but what should the default be? I guess you want it to be a generic S. Do they implement default for server? They do, and they set it to unit. That's interesting. I am curious why. It feels like you'd want it to be generic. Let's keep it that way for now. So now we should get less errors. And we do. So from like what, 200 something down to like 27. That's not bad. And it's mostly like into service that fails. Honestly, I think we should do the fallback thing that we talked about earlier. So this one becomes fallback service. And this becomes fallback, and it takes a HTSB handler H, and we can probably copy the bounds from here. Oh, that's kind of funny that we never mentioned the handler trait in router at all. B is already used, S is already used, that makes sense. Cool, and then this becomes self fallback service into service No, that becomes handler into service self state clone. Probably just because we need to clone it before calling a method. Like that. Cool. So this is in Axum Extra. I'm still wondering why we removed that from the workspace, but it's still getting picked up. It's sort of annoying. Like, I don't want to fix stuff in Axum Extra for now. Oh yeah, and that was because in this case it assumed that the state was body, and then the default body was, well, the default value, which is also body. So we just have to say, can just infer it. And this is just like that. This is so much nicer because now you can just provide a closure directly. You don't need to wrap it in parens and call .into service and all that. Should router default the state type? I don't think so. I think you should have to declare what the state is here. On service. So this test is specifically just testing for routing between services. It doesn't really care about state. So in this case, we can just call into service directly. It's just a convenient way to get a service from a handler function. Cannot infer type of S on a handler. Yeah, that was this thing that we sort of ran into before, where it was annoying that we had to call into service here just to add a layer. I think if we do the same thing here, where we just carry the S type forward, so like layered, does it implement handler or does it implement service? It implements handler. And it doesn't implement service. So if you have a layered, you still have to call .into service, which is where you then provide the state. So if we just sort of require you to pass in the state later, I think that's fine. What should the order of the params be? TS. I don't actually know what the implementation is going to look like, but we can just do that later. That's annoying. Previously we've been changing, because we have to add another S here. And previously, so this one S is for service. And then we've been changing that to T, but that's already taken. That's annoying. Let's just say this is SVC. Yeah, in the beginning of the stream, we talked about s. That is s. In the beginning of the stream, we talked about like how do you name these generic type parameters, because usually you just use single letters, but some people think, and I agree, that that's not very clear, but you just sort of do it for historical or habit reasons, whatever. But you know, there's exceptions. If you have both a request and a response body, I like to name them rec and res body, so it's not just like b in or b out or b1 and b2. So let's say this one gets an s, this one gets a t and an s. We don't need to be able to format the state. We don't need to be able to clone it either, because we're just sort of carrying forward what the type is. Like that. S may not live long enough. There we go. And this file compiles. And that means this thing compiles now too, because when we call .layer, it remembers what state this one needs. It doesn't actually know it yet, because this handler doesn't sort of declare its state. So it's just sort of left as like a to be inferred later parameter. Get can't infer it either, but we can actually infer it when we get up to route, because then we know what s is on the router, and then that type sort of gets instantiated all the way down. In this case, the state is it's just unit, because that's what new does. That becomes like this. This is about good error message if using nest root. So this test has gone away, because in the next version of Axum, which is implemented in a different PR, this setup will exactly just work. Axum extra, more routing tests. This is so much nicer. I really like that. Now there's only things, there's stuff down here. All right. This one goes away. All right, now let's look at Axum Extra. Hello from Sweden. Hello from Denmark. What is... we were starting resource before as well. I suppose it needs an S. Named and state S, resource S, S. And I just noticed now that we don't actually want derive debug on resource, because then it requires the body to be debugged. We're not storing a body anywhere. Like router doesn't store it. It goes into endpoint, it goes into method router, but method router doesn't have a B inside of it. So it doesn't actually need to be debugged. I'm just going to make a little note of that and maybe file an issue on it. Resource shouldn't derive debug. Is this Arch? You mean Arch Linux? Nope, it's Mac OS. I just have a full screen terminal. B cannot be shared. S cannot be shared. Router. Why? That's because there needs an S in the middle. Just do a Vim macro. What is it complaining about? Method router doesn't implement service. Yeah, it does. The window manager, well, not window manager, I don't really know what to call it, is that I'm using to have like tabs in the terminal and like splits and stuff like that is Tmux. We're probably just missing some bounds on all these methods, and that's why it's complaining. We do have S is clone, right? We have that on the entire impl. Because it calls self route. That just takes a method router. SB. Yeah, I've used Tmux for, I don't even know, several years. It's really good. I recommend it. Expected router unknown. We're just missing the state there. More compilers. Are you running an M1 Mac? Yes, this is an M1 Air. This one takes an S. The macro is very handy. Nice keyboard. I see it more and more. I might get tempted. What are the switches? Cherry MX Brown? No, I bought it with Cherry MX Brown, but I changed them. They're called like Kale Box something something. These. Whoa, sorry, that was very bright. I don't remember what color they are. I think brown, but I'm honestly not sure. If we just take out one of the switches, can we see? Yep, that one is brown. I don't think it shows up on camera, but it's brown. So it's these, I think. Kale box brown. Yep. I think they were available on the Moonlander website where I bought it. So it is a yeah, expert mode. Kale bronze? No, there's like a box around it. These. I think these are the ones that I got. Kale box brown. I like them a lot. They're not, I mean, they have the sort of loud click, but it's not like as loud as blues, like Cherry MX blues, which I've had before. But yeah, they feel good. Yeah, I'm not super familiar with the sort of entire world of like mechanical switches and all that. I heard that these were nice, and I watched some like videos and sound tests and stuff like that, and then I just went for it. But what's nice about this keyboard is that you can hot swap the switches without having to solder or anything. They just pop right out with this little tool that we're using just before. So it's fairly low effort to switch if you want. It's mostly about money, of course, which is also a concern. Have you tried HHKeyB? Is that the happy hacking keyboard? I have not. That's not a split keyboard, right? I specifically want a split keyboard. I really like that. That what you get from that, the sort of ergonomics wise. I have used smaller sort of regular keyboards before, but I really like split keyboards. What made you choose the Moonlander over the ErgoDox? The ErgoDox is the old or older model that they have, right? I don't know. Mostly the Moonlander was newer. I honestly didn't research the ErgoDox very much. One thing I do like about the ErgoDox is I think it has more buttons on the thumb cluster. Yeah, it has like more smaller buttons. It has 6 buttons or something, where this one only has 4. So that's one thing that it has going for it. Yeah, I know some people who have the happy hacking keyboard and they really like it. I've had so many different kinds of keyboards, and I kind of promised myself that I wouldn't spend more money on keyboards. Like this one is not endgame, obviously. That's not a thing, but I don't have any sort of immediate desire to switch to anything else. Tray bound, router sealed. That makes sense. This one takes a method router. And we'll obviously have to implement this at some point, and the types will, or the tests will remind us about that. What else? I wish, can you like filter, if you just search for E, does that show all of them? I'm not sure. Oh, this one's funny. This one is a router of NES, I guess. So spa router, which we're looking at now, is just sort of a little convenience router that we make that you can like serve assets at the /assets path from the dist directory. So it's just a little convenience thing for serving assets for like static file, for like single page apps basically. And then you can just merge that into a router, and that works via this from implementation. So if you have a spa router, you can convert it into a router. Router new. It needs to be that. Ooh, this is funny. This is not gonna work. If you convert this, so if you say this is an S, spa router just converts itself into any router of type S. That means down here you need to be able to provide an S. You need to call with state and actually provide it a value of type S. But we don't have a value of type S, and it's just a generic type. We know nothing about it. We can't possibly produce it. So we have to say like this is new and just say, hey, the state is just unit. Like that. That means when you then call merge, fn merge, here requires that the state is the same. How are we going to deal with that? Does that mean this one has to be an S2? Because like we're discarding the state anyway. We talked about that earlier. But I'm not sure if Rust is able to infer what this S2 needs to be. What are you working on? So I maintain a library in Rust called Axum, which is a web framework, part of the Tokyo organization. And we're working on a refactoring for that, basically making state more explicit, how you pass that to your route handlers. Before previously, it wasn't done in like a type-safe way, and you might get runtime errors if you did something wrong. Yeah. So that means that the routes inside of it will have an S2. This is a method router. I think, what if let's try to do it here. Struct router S, state S. And it has fn merge, self, other is a T, returns self. Where T into router S. I expect this to work. So if I say fn foo has a router nothing. Let's just give it a new. Like that, and then we say router router merge, router new, false. That obviously doesn't work because the states don't match. it expected a router bool, but it got a router of unit. So if I pass that in, that works. If I say this is sum S2, S2, is still able to infer it. Okay, that's good, because I was worried that Rust wasn't going to be able to do that. What if we have a struct A that infiltrate from a full router of bool? Sometimes my Rust analyzer don't want to show me the suggestion window thing. Is it like all dead? Whoa, what happened? How was the previous way, the extensions extractor? Exactly. So the issue that we had was that if you extract an extension that you haven't added the corresponding middleware for, then you'd get an error at runtime. So if you do this without also having done this, where you actually write the state, then that would fail at runtime, but it'll compile just fine. So we're basically requiring you to pass the state when you construct the router, and then we're adding a new dedicated extractor called state, which we haven't gotten to yet. That will get that out. If I ban that guy, does he get kicked from chat? Filter their messages out of chat you don't moderate. Whatever. We'll just do that. That works. Can I then also say router with an A? That works too. Okay. Okay, that's cool. So it does actually work. This is what I was worried. I was worried that Rust was going to be like, I can't actually infer what state type you want here. So that's cool. So that means this is not actually an issue after all. So this is an S2. It's sort of annoying now that this is a method router. Maybe we can call it that. Method router. But it has obviously type S2. It doesn't store anything of S2. So honestly, we need a way to almost change the type from S2 to S. Could do like downcast state S, something like that. I think that is the only way. Yeah, let's try to do that and see if that works. So that can go here. Pub crate fn. Downcast state self. Method router S2 B and E. Wait, where are the buttons? Record macro, go to the beginning of the line, go to the first parenthesis, delete the rest of the line, self get comma line up join line down. Like that. Now this compiles. I think we can even get rid of that one. Provide the state. This is fallback service. It's a little annoying that code like this gets more complicated, because that means if users don't want to use SPA router for whatever reason and they want to do this, write this by hand, that gets more complicated to do. I think I'll make a note of that and see if we can think about it. I've thought for a long time. So the reason that we need to wrap servdir. So servdir is a service from Tower HTTP that just serves static files from a directory. And the reason that you need to wrap it and get service and handle error is because servdir, if it can't read the file, if that fails for some reason, the service itself fails with an IO error. But if like an error bubbles all the way up to hyper will terminate the connection and not send a response. So what axum requires you to do is to have infallible as your service error type, which basically means a service can never fail, and you're guaranteed that you'll always get a response. You won't just terminate the connection without sending a response. And that's basically what this handle error does. I've been thinking for the longest time that it would be so nice if service error, or if servdir rather, didn't return IO errors. It just returned a 500 if it was unable to read the file, or I don't know what other response code is more appropriate, but it didn't return an error in the tower service sense. And then maybe still had a way for users to customize how to, what response to return in the case of a failure. But it should have just the default 500 with an empty body. Because then all this code would basically become, that would just become this, and that would just be this, would just be this, which is so much nicer. So yeah, I might make that change for Tower HTTP one day, or at least propose it, but it's something that I've been thinking about. But yeah, having to do this definitely makes it that much more annoying. That servdir is fallible. Can you only have one state? Yes, you can only have one state. We do allow you to, I don't know that I have that code anymore, but we will allow you to basically, if you have one, you still have to have one state type, but if you have multiple nested states inside of it, you can implement the from trait to go from the outer state to the inner state. And then that conversion will happen automatically. So you can sort of have sub-states, if you will, but each router can only have one state. And that's just the trade-off that we have to make to be able to actually implement this in the first place. So if you want multiple states that have nothing to do with each other and don't know about each other, you have to use extensions, but then you lose the type safety, of course. Yeah, so having to do stuff like this is really quite annoying. This calls route service. No, that is with state, because it's a method router. I somehow thought that we were calling into service on the handler on the inside. Is there a way to just get it to show me the errors? Oh my god, it built, you guys. It doesn't work at all, but like, it compiled. Sweet. Cool, so that means handler is the trail basically ends here, right? If you scroll down and look at the implementations, we don't actually allow, if we look at, where is it, core, extractor mod, axum core, and from request doesn't know anything about the state yet. So we're gonna have to add it there. Let's just commit. Begin threading the state through. Nice. Let's just move on down the pipe and say there's an S here, and there's an S here. There is an S here. An S there. If you convert a request part back into a response, you basically drop the state. Nice, and then we want an accessor for the state. And then from request takes an S. And this change we're gonna have to make in like a million places, I think. I'm pretty sure we're gonna have to make S send as well, but I'm not sure. So this one here becomes S, and how does handler get the state? Do you have to pass state into handler call? I think so. That goes in there. And S. What is this one saying? This is how you extract the request. Let's just say rec state clone. So this is, if you've ever extracted, if you've ever tried to do something like this, where you extract the request first and then something afterwards, you might run into the issue where the ordering of these two matters, and this will fail because when you extract the request, you consume all the extensions, and then even though an extension that was previously there, that's obviously now gone because they've all been consumed, and now you're just left with an empty extension map, basically. And that's this code that is responsible for that. So when you extract a request, we can't consume the request parts here because we only have mutable access to it. So we just replace it with a default one. And in here, we just say, make a new empty extensions map. There's not much else that we can really do, but this PR sort of reworks that system and makes that work, such that you can't accidentally, it'll require requests to always be the last extractor that you use. Basically, any extractor that can consume the body or the extensions, those have to be last. And yeah, so when we make the new request part that we leave in its place, we can just say we clone the previous state. SB. I think we can do some quick search and replace to do most of these. Cool. Into service, that is self state clone. Are you the core maintainer of Axum? Yep, I am. Unless there's sync, that's because S needs to be send. Yeah, so this is the change that I expected that we'll have to make. That AC trait will require S to be send, because here we have, I'm not quite sure why, but I think it's because we have a mutable reference to it or something like that. We don't have a mutable reference to an S, but yeah, I'm not quite sure. But it's fine because your state is going to have to be thread safe anyway, so it doesn't really matter that we require that. S send. Like that. We're most likely gonna have to say that S is send and static, because otherwise the future that we return here is not send and static because it moves S into it. S comma B. Yeah, I knew this one was going to be fun. Cool. So Axum has a middleware. Well, it has I guess it's a middleware. It has a way for you to convert an extractor into a middleware. There's this function called middleware from extractor. So imagine you have some sort of like authorization extractor that you use on some handlers. We don't use them here, but you could imagine using it in there. And then you also want to be able to use that as a middleware. Then you can say from extractor and give it the type of your extractor. What state should that use? And how does it get it? I'm tempted to say that the state should just be unit. But that means that if your extractor on the inside that you're like converting into a middleware needs state, then it can't get it. And you would have to pass that in some other way. I'm not sure how to fix that because route layer doesn't know anything about extractors. It just knows about things that implement like tower layer and tower service. So it's like tower layer and tower service don't know anything about state. So there's no way for there to be like a typed connection between the state that the router that you're calling route layer on, the state that it has, and the state that this middleware, this extractor specifically, expects. So I think we'll just say that from extractor only allows unit as the state, and then we can possibly consider how to improve that. And then that basically means that you would have to not use your extractor as the not convert your extractor into a middleware in this way, but you would have to write a middleware differently, possibly even using extensions. Of course, then you lose type safety. How do extractors like Json work? Like this line, JSON input, some kind of destruction. Yeah, exactly. You can, in Rust, you can actually do pattern matching effectively directly in function arguments if the pattern that you're matching on can never fail. So like you can't match on option in function arguments, obviously, because if you just match on some, it might fail because the option might actually be a none. But in the case of JSON, it's just a tuple struct with a single public field. It's literally just defined like this. And then you can pattern match on it directly in function arguments. It's basically the same as like doing path.0 on the first line and rebinding that to a new variable. It's just a little bit more, it looks a little bit nicer to do it this way. But it's definitely sort of foreign to see that in function arguments. I don't think you see that many other places. But it's quite common with Axum because it works so well for these kinds of tuple structs. But where are the errors handled? Good question. If we look at handler, so handler is how all that magic basically works. That was the trait that we were looking at before. That takes a request and produces a future that produces a response. And then handler is implemented for a handler of a tuple of one type is implemented for a function that takes a T1 where T1 implements from request. And then that just goes up from there. So like 2 arguments where the function takes both of them and they both implement from request and all the way up to 16 arguments. And if you look at the macro, that's exactly this one, where all that code is generated. So this macro takes some number of identifiers separated by commas, and then all the types are expanded here and here and here. And then just for each of those types, it just calls from request on that specific type, does a match. If the value succeeds, then we return it. If the value fails, with some rejection type here. So if the extractor fails, then we convert the rejection into a response and we return that. So we effectively short circuit. And that means that self down here, which is the function, is never called because we can't call it. We don't have a value of the type that we need to call it. So this is where the errors are handled. Where were we? Over here. Yeah, so this one needs to be from request of unit. And that means that down here we can provide it. And I don't know if Rust Analyzer is slow or what's going on, why that one is like lingering. You're welcome. It definitely can seem a little magical when you first see it, because you don't handle any errors yourself. It just kind of happens automatically behind the scenes. SB, what is this one complaining? Oh, okay, it was just Rust Analyzer that was slow. Yeah, I can see what was wrong there. SB. Oops. So this is basically just updating all the extractors that we have in Axum to use the SB to have the additional generic parameter. Fortunately, all the changes, because users are going to have to do the same change. Fortunately, it's very mechanical. I can't type. SB. This is going to break backwards compatibility. No, yeah, you're totally right. It is. So this is going to go out in version 0.6 and not in 0.5. Extension. Why does that fail? I think that fails because there's probably compilers over here. Oh. Not a problem for reaching 1.0. No, like Axum is not going to be 1.0 anytime soon. specifically because we want to be able to fix things like this if one day, a year later, we figure out a solution for it. Which is like what happened in this case. Why does this not like want to build? Let's just fix some other errors. SB. I'm not like too worried about breaking the API as long as the changes that people have to make aren't too annoying. Like adding these additional type parameters to from request is not too bad. Like you don't really have to understand why you do it. You can just kind of look in the change log. And like I'm going to write in the change log, like this is what the code looks like before. This is what it has to look like now, so that it's easy for people to update. But it's definitely a trade-off of how much additional complexity you want to add. I do think in this case the feature is worth it. So this is the error handling stuff. So if we look at spa that we looked at earlier, when you call .handle error, it applies this handle error middleware, and the function that you give it can run extractors. I think I have an example of that somewhere. Maybe, at least in the docs. Oh, maybe not. But yeah, like you call .handle error and you give it some function, and that function can run extractors. And obviously we need to make sure that all those extractors are from request. And since it's a middleware, I think it needs to be from request of no state, for the same reason that the middleware from Extractor also needed to have unit state earlier. Because then we can construct it down here. Like that. Same thing here. So this one is when you call from fn. When you make a middleware just from an async function like this, in the next version of Axum, you'll be able to both get the request as the first argument, but you'll also be able to put any number of extractors that you want in here. Pretty sure we have docs on that. Let me see. Here. So this is the middleware function that we make. It takes request and next, but in Axum 0.6, you can also just put any number of extractors as the first arguments. As long as next is the last argument, it'll still work. Because we got a lot of questions from people for like how do you run extractors in middleware, and it's a little like you can do it now in Axum 0.5. If you look at the middleware docs down here, I think it's actually in Extractor. Here, running extractors from middleware. You can basically make your own request parts and then call the middleware and then get the request back out from the request parts. But in the next version of Axum, like I said, you can just put extractors directly in here, which is way nicer. is working on Axum your full-time job or doing it on your free time? It's mostly on my free time. We do use it at work, and I do have time at work that I'm allowed to spend on like open source projects that are sort of important for the stuff that we do at work. I don't tend to do that much like implementation coding work on Axum during work, but like answering people's questions and like looking at issues and stuff like that I do during work hours. But most of the implementation work happens outside of work. I work at Embark Studios, a Swedish game development company that uses a lot of Rust. SP. So like all our backend services are done using Axum. What is that? I feel like that's just Rust Analyzer. That hasn't updated in a while. Handler. For nothing. Closure that doesn't take any arguments. Layered. Yeah, layered just doesn't work because it converts the handler to a service. Yeah, we haven't really figured that out yet. I think I'm just gonna to-do that one for now. I think we'll have to store the handler and the layer, and when you call the handler, then we apply the layer, or then we convert it into a service, supply the state, add the layer, call it. I think we can probably do that here. Nah, I really want to get to actually writing the state extractor. It's like almost midnight. So we're not going to be going for that much longer, but I really want to like actually get to the state extractor. S cannot be sent between threads. We're going to have to do this in a whole bunch of places, I think. Yeah, and we can do that because from request up here is unit. This is in a test, so that's fine. I have a bunch of tests where we're making request parts. And now we're in Axum Extra. Does that mean that Axum compiled? Maybe. Little hands. Yeah, the position of the camera and like the keyboard camera on OBS makes it look like I have T-Rex hands. I did not consider that when I made that camera setup. My goal is that long term, like underneath that black area that's currently down there, I want Twitch chat, so that when I upload the VODs later to YouTube, people can still see the chat. So yeah, whenever we make a breaking change to Axum, we feel it. We don't do that willy-nilly because we have to update all our tests. So we don't break stuff just for fun. Yeah, we're not gonna have to worry about the. Well, we're gonna have to worry about the doc tests some other day. SB. Hopefully soon there. SB. I keep like accidentally pasting instead. Is that everything? Would you look at that? It actually compiled. That is awesome. And that means that in axum extractor mod, we can write a state extractor. State s pub s s is clone. The rejection is infallible or fails. Okay, self rec state clone. Cool. And then I believe I have some routing tests somewhere. Test routes. Routing tests. App state. We called it with state. And then we should be able to say async fn handler route get handler. Yeah, thank you for joining and thank you for asking questions. If you want, you can follow me on Twitter. I usually announce streams ahead of time over there. Method route exists. This one doesn't implement clone. Cool, and then we should be able to say state of just whatever, we don't really care, of state, app state. And yeah, this extractor we want to re-export from here, like that. State. And that should build. So obviously there's a whole bunch of warnings and there are things that we've just to-do'd out, but like it seems that all the types actually check, which is kind of what we wanted. Let's say that if we just try to extract something else, then it should not compile. And it doesn't, and it says that it expected a method router of state, of app state, but it got one of unit, which is right. And then let's do the trick that we talked about where we implement converting, or basically downcasting to inner states. So this one has an inner, that's an inner state. And then we implement from app state for inner state. And we can say state, state inner. And then we should be able to also extract inner state. And I don't think this will work because our state extractor doesn't actually support that yet. We need inner. There. Let's just pull that out into a variable. And that fails for the same reason. And then we say we extract an S2 where S2 where S is into S2. Let outer state is rec state clone. Inner state is outer state into, and then this one is inner state. I kind of don't like these names. I think I want to just call this one inner state. And call this one outer state. Like that. And this one should build now as well. Sweet. And if we remove this one, it should not build. And it doesn't. Awesome. Yeah. I think that is all we're gonna do for today. Let's just look at how big our diff even was. What do we want to call it? Yeah, you see, like we touched all the files. Path pass state to extractors. I mean, it's not too bad. 700 additions and 400 deletions. That's okay. I think that's within the realm of what you'd expect. Obviously, we're not done. We still have to actually make it work, but all the like plumbing is just there. Now it's just to make sure that the state actually gets injected correctly. Cool. I think my sort of overall impression of how that went is that it actually went pretty painlessly. I mean, it's a pretty big diff, but it's not too bad. And many of the tests we didn't have to change. Because if you just do router new, you get the default state of just unit. Which I think is going to be nice for users when they update. So they don't have to change their code to not use extensions anymore. Just because, like, if that works, they can just keep on using it, and then they can opt into using this new state stuff if they want to. Yeah, so I want to say thank you to everybody who joined. If there's any final questions, now is the time. I don't know if we can look at like the to-dos that were left. Axum, source, t, rust. What was this one? 289. Oh yeah, that wasn't merged. So we did verify that that actually did work. I think I'll just leave the to-do so we have like a reminder for ourselves that to actually test it. Yeah, I think I'm gonna leave it here. We'll probably, maybe I'll do the rest off stream. Maybe we'll do another one next week. I'm not quite sure. But yeah, thank you all for joining. Yeah, I guess I'll see you in the next stream. Thanks for being in the chat, and thanks for asking questions. And yeah, have a great day, great evening, great whatever, whatever time it is where you are. I'm definitely gonna go to bed now because it's like almost midnight. So see ya. Take care.